Seems like a lot of paper this morning. Well, as I mentioned, we're beginning our month of discussing the ideas around emotional intelligence. It happens to be something that has popped up fairly recently in my world, in several different places. I think it's a pretty fascinating topic and can have real relevance in our lives. And I think over the rest of this month and during the rest of the presentations, we'll see there really is a real spiritual value and connection with the idea of emotional intelligence. I'm going to start out with an official introduction to the theme, and this is all taken from the Touchstones package, but it really sets the stage for what emotional intelligence is and what it's all about, and we'll kind of get us started, I guess. In 1983, Dr. Howard Gardner, a professor of education at Harvard, introduced a theory of multiple intelligences in his book, Frames of Mind, the theory of multiple intelligences. He suggested that the traditional notion of intelligence based on IQ testing was far too limited. Gardner defined multiple intelligence as a set of abilities, talents, and mental skills. Gardner proposed 8 intelligences: music rhythmic, visual spatial, verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, bodily kinesthetic, and then interpersonal and intrapersonal, and naturalistic. These would account for a broader range of human potential in children and adults. Critics of his theory suggested that rather than the word intelligence, Gardner should have used the word ability. In response, he bristled, "I balk at the unwarranted assumption that certain human abilities can be arbitrarily singled out as intelligence while others cannot. The theory of multiple intelligences has played an important role in education." Psychologist Daniel Goleman's 1995 book, Emotional Intelligence: Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, was inspired in 1990 when Goleman, who was working as a science reporter at the New York Times, read an academic journal article by psychologists John Mayer and Peter Salovey that offered a formulation of a concept they called emotional intelligence, which is sometimes referred to as EQ. Goleman's book was widely influential, and it was on the New York Times bestseller for about a year and a half, that list, and it was a bestseller in many countries and translated into at least 40 languages. Goleman noted that his model of emotional intelligence built on Gardner's model of multiple intelligences. He wrote, "In my theory, self-awareness and self-regulation are the intrapersonal abilities, and empathy and social skill, the interpersonal. These emotional competencies are not innate talents. They are learned capabilities that can be nurtured in children and adults. Although Goleman believes that the individuals are born with a general emotional intelligence that determines their potential for learning emotional competencies." I guess that would be the nature versus nurture sort of discussion. These emotional competencies are defined as follows: self-awareness, the ability to recognize and understand your moods, emotions, and drives, as well as their effects on others. Self-regulation, the ability to control or redirect disruptive impulses and moods related to emotions, the propensity to suspend judgment, to think before acting, and those are the intrapersonal elements. Motivation, a passion to work for reasons that go beyond money or status, a propensity to pursue goals with energy and persistence. Empathy, the ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people. Skill, excuse me, here it is. Skill in treating people according to their emotional reactions. And finally, social skill, proficiency in managing relationships and building networks, an ability to find common ground and build rapport. Well, the concept of emotional intelligence first appeared in a 1964 paper by Michael Beldock. It was foreshadowed in 350 BCE in the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. In book 4, in the section on temperament, Aristotle wrote, "Anyone can become angry. That is easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy." Thomas Buckley writes that sinfulness, and that word sinfulness will come up again later, the sinfulness of anger may not lie in anger itself, but in prolonged attachment to it, in the refusal out of fear to let ourselves back into the impermanent world of interrelationship across the bridge of sadness. The difference between these two observations about the anger is emotional intelligence. It is emotional intelligence that allows us to cross the bridge of sadness. Judith Orloff writes that anger can be a healthy reaction to injustice, such as cultures fighting to free themselves from repressive regimes. On a personal level, anger can be good if it's expressed in a focused, healthy way, rather than using it to punish or harm others. In her book, Emotional Freedom, Orloff writes, "Our society is in the midst of an emotional meltdown. People are restless, volatile, our temper is about to blow. Domestic violence occurs in 1 out of 6 households. 50% of drivers who are cut off respond with horn honking, yelling, obscene gestures, or even road rage, which can be fatal. Half of our marriages end in divorce. And none of this is how we want life to be. Our pressure cooker society pushes us to our emotional limits. But we commonly think of freedom as uncensored speech, emancipation from slavery, and the right to vote and worship as we choose. You can't achieve total freedom until you learn to take charge of emotions instead of them running you. This is a radical paradigm shift we all can make, regardless of our present anxieties or past hardships." In his 1995 book, Goleman suggested that emotional intelligence or skills such as active listening, reciprocalness, empathy, use of dialogue, and openness can help create the conditions necessary for reflective change. An especially effective approach to reflective dialogue called nonviolent communication was developed by Marshall Rosenberg. His 1999 book, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, provides a comprehensive method to promote reflective dialogue. Nonviolent communication is based on the following 4 steps. Observe a situation as objectively as possible without evaluating, blaming, or moralistically judging yourself or the other person. State how your observation is making you feel. What emotions are rising in you? So state how your observation is making you feel, but not what you think about what is happening, which can lead to judging, criticizing, or blaming. Identify a need or value that is not being met, like trust or understanding, which may include trying to understand what need or value is not being met for the other person. And based on the first 3 steps, make a request specifically and clearly about what you want or need from the other person. Initially, the process may seem cumbersome or contrived, but its application of emotional intelligence can lead to healthier and more meaningful relationships. While the emphasis on emotional intelligence has often been focused on leadership and workplace success, Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People came to my mind. It is critical for our individual and collective well-being as we struggle to address the many challenges of contemporary society. And for those who are interested in the ideas about emotional intelligence, the Emotional Intelligence Institute was founded in 2001 by Sandra Hughes McDevitt. 2006, they launched Emotional Intelligence Awareness Month, which happens to be October. So I'm guessing that's not a coincidence that we're talking about emotional intelligence this month. Also offers extensive training in emotional intelligence and links to EQ assessment. If you're interested, I've got the website here. Don't know if anybody will write it down, but I do have it. Maybe I can get it posted on our website. So that's sort of the official introduction to emotional intelligence brought to us through Touchstones. When I began thinking about emotional intelligence as a theme for this month, the Four Agreements book got into my head and it wouldn't leave. The voice got louder as we talked about our first principle in September, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. It all somehow seemed related. And since the voice in my head was loud and insistent, and it wasn't going away, it seemed best to go ahead and revisit the Four Agreements from some years back. So here's what I wrote about the Four Agreements back in 2013. It was called Voices in Our Heads. Ironically, that stuff does get stuck, right? So how many of you will admit to hearing voices in your head? I'm guessing all of us do at times. Not the cartoon kind, but the endless chatter of other humans, past conversations, events, anxieties, anticipations, missed opportunities, slights, real or perceived, things we should have done or shouldn't have. In short, the running conversations that many people have about their lives, including conversations about events and people not in the same room, maybe not even alive anymore. There they are. Think of how harsh those intruding voices and conversations can be sometimes. Who's our own harshest critic? Who really keeps us from doing things? Is it others, or is it that stuff in our heads? What keeps us from changing in ways we want? Often it's these conversations of a lifetime that intrude and interfere with our ability to listen to our own voice. And that can keep us from being who we really are and want to be. Well, Toltecs apparently heard voices too and had a term for that internal chatter. They called it matot or matoti. And it's the noise of the world intruding on us. It's not only self-generated chatter, but comes from the world at large and gains strength and volume via agreements that we've made with ourselves and the outside world. Agreements that we aren't as smart as other people, or that we are better than others. Agreements that certain events are okay because that's just the way it is. It has to be that way. Agreements that we can never do something, so why try? Agreements that we are special, agreements that we're insignificant, we're deserving or undeserving. All the agreements that comprise the matote are what keep us in a fog and keep us from being who we truly are. Well, the Toltecs thought about it and developed 4 agreements that we can make with ourselves that can set us free of the matote and let us live a life we never thought possible. I learned about the idea of these agreements through the fascinating book called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And that's what I want to present this morning back in 2013. I think Phil turned me on to this book and I have never forgotten that. Always appreciated that. I've shared this book with other people too. This is kind of an aside, but it actually was very helpful when I was dealing with a pretty serious depression. And I shared it with a couple other people that were going through some of the same sort of stuff. And I think they found it helpful. So, no judgment. It's all good. Anyway, the agreements are: be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. And when I always forget, do your best. Be impeccable with your word. Our word is the most powerful thing we have, whether it's written, spoken, or simply thought. Think the havoc that has been spread by misuse of words. Politicians and leaders come to mind. Think of the poison spread through rumors and gossip, or maybe even worse, by innocent or thoughtless remarks made by a loved one or a parent that left a mark for years. And think of the words we use against ourselves to judge and punish ourselves. Using words can be a form of black magic or a source of joy and strength. Impeccable, this book, is derived from Latin and means, or can mean, without sin. So think of this as an agreement to use our words without sin, either against others or ourselves. This is portrayed as the most important of the four agreements, and the others generally flowing from it. So be impeccable with your word is the advice. Don't take anything personally. Taking things personally is a form of egotism because it assumes that what others say is about us, when it's really more likely to be about them and their own metotean agreements. Taking things personally leads to having arguments over right and wrong. We agree to accept a poison dart that has power over us. But if we agree with ourselves that it has nothing to do with us, then we are free from its poisonous effects. Recognize that mostly everything others do or say is because of them, not us, can be liberating. It also counsels us not to take our own self-criticism or internal thoughts personally, as much of what we think probably isn't true anyway, and was derived from outside sources in most likelihood. We can't avoid needless suffering by taking things too personally. Don't make assumptions. We confuse assumptions with truth, thinking they are real. When applied to others, we perceive slights, an intent that isn't there, or a host of other things. Take it personally, and then we spread poison through our own words. Making assumptions is at the root of a tremendous amount of needless suffering, angst, and drama. We usually assume everyone thinks like we do, but remember, they all have their own unique and agreements. So try not to take it too personally and don't make assumptions. And finally, just do the best you can. This one is simple. You just do your best. Even though your best won't be the same from day to day or moment to moment, you try to do your best. Then our internal judges don't have a leg to stand on when they tell us somehow we didn't measure up. Doing our best is something we all know when we do it, and it always gives us reason to feel good and to celebrate. If we can do our best at everything we do, it will always be good enough. So it's not surprising if these agreements sound familiar. Like most good ideas, they crop up over and over. In this case, I found myself thinking about, to thine own self be true. Forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And there are lots more examples. So once again, universal principles surface independently. The Four Agreements is a thought-provoking, interesting, and ideally useful presentation of four powerful agreements we can make with ourselves for personal growth. If you haven't read the book, I urge you to borrow my copy or find a copy at the library, take a look at it. So that's more or less what I said about the Four Agreements back in 2013. And I hope it serves as an overview of the basic ideas in the book. Currently, this book sold over 10 million copies. So it's obvious that a lot of people have found the ideas helpful or at the very least interesting. And I think I mentioned that it's been said the first agreement, being impeccable with your word, really informs the other three agreements. And I think that's, for me, that's an important thing to keep in mind because it's easier for me to remember one agreement than four. So focus on the first one, and that seems to cause things to come out from it. So isn't all this nice? Excuse me. I was hoping for some inspired connections between the idea of emotional intelligence, one or more of our UU principles, and the four agreements, kind of tie all that together in a nice, neat package. I'm not sure that happened. So maybe it's best just to plant the seed and leave it up to others to make those connections if they happen to see them. But here's what I came up with for myself, the take-home message, if you will. In a real general sense, incorporating the four agreements facilitates, or actually may be, a form of emotional intelligence. And it almost seems prerequisite to truly living our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of everybody. I think practicing the four agreements can really help develop and strengthen the healthy attributes of emotional intelligence. And it makes it easier to live our first principle. I can't prove any of this, but it sure feels right for me. And I think it might be helpful to keep the 4 agreements in mind as we think about and discuss emotional intelligence during the rest of the month. So I look forward to our discussion in a few minutes. If you are so inclined, we're going to try another hymn. This one is called This Old World. It's number 315. I bet Janet shared the words online.
Why don't I just play it once? When you find it.
I'm sure we've done this one before.
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
I'll play it once.
This old world is full